From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to see you all here. My name is David Plylar, and I'm a music specialist here at the Library of Congress. And I'm just going to speak to you a little bit about the program that we have tonight, and maybe just show you a few little insights into, in particular, into one of the holdings, or the manuscript holdings that we have at the library, which is the first manuscript version of Brahms' Handel Variations, the Variations in Fugue on a theme by Handel. So I'll have some images of that up later towards the end of the talk. So firstly, there's something in common with each of these pieces, well, most of the pieces that you're going to hear in tonight's performance. They all heavily draw on the tradition of fugue, one by one of the, the person that we always think of with fugue or associate with the fugue, J.S. Bach, and then others who kind of follow in that in his footsteps with essays in the genre that are kind of battling with the same sorts of issues that Bach was dealing with in his, but then taking them in different directions. So I thought we would start by just talking a little bit about, if I can get this correct, the fugal system. There are lots of politics in music, especially the types of words that we use. We talk about mastery of form and wanting to master the fugue, and fugues have often had this sort of academic, like highest aspiration for composers, that they want to be able to compose a fugue well, and they want to be the master of the subject with all the answers, showing off at an exposition, in their exposition, swiftly dealing with any episodes of kind of unruly musical characters, and often finding different ways to augment their reputation, especially by straddling their stuff towards the end of the fugue. So I apologize. You're going to be in for it tonight, but how does one manage this, and how does one strive to master these types of things historically? Those are questions that we might just hint at tonight, but we're not going to try to tackle because they're very large types of questions. So in a fugal system, many people, their eyes glaze over when you start to get into the details of fugal structures, and so we're not going to do that here. So instead, we're going to look specifically at where fugues have trod, like what types of things are we talking about when we speak of a fugue? Is it the structure of a fugue that gives it its identity as a fugue? Or is it rather a collection of traits? Or is it some combination of these things? There is no real perfect example of what a fugue is. Often it's described as having an exposition and having other sorts of developmental qualities, going through episodes and then coming back to some sort of summation and a sort of a return in a way that's somewhat similar to a sonata. But what I would rather focus on as a listener, especially if you're a listener who's hearing a particular fugue for a first time, is how is it that we tend to approach it? And there's lots of different ways, and everybody has a different approach to it. But it's dependent on the material that a composer is using, the actual composer, the particular traits of that composer, and the time in which the composer is writing it. Another factor that we're going to look at in particular with the fugues that we're going to hear today is their location with respect to the rest of the music in the program. They have basically a locus ultimus. They're the last thing that you hear in each work. And I'm talking about the preludes and fugues in Bach from the first book of Well-Tempered Clavier. It's not fugues and preludes, it's preludes and fugues. So they're kind of these pairs where the fugue is the point where you're going towards. And then in the Beethoven, the fugue comes at the end with some modifications. And the same with the Brahms, the fugue comes at the end. But all of them exhibit certain traits that tend to come through quite clearly. And these deal with issues of variation that we find in other types of developmental strategies in non-fugue works. One thing that I do notice when I'm listening to a fugue, and I'm just thinking in the abstract here, is I think in terms of voices. Like usually there's a presentation of a single idea that I listen to. And then I think of them in terms of layering. I may not know at what pitch level it's going to come in next or something like that. I might have an idea. But I'll get the sense that it's another voice that's being layered onto it. I also get a sense that there's a limited number of ingredients that are going into the mix that are contributing to this musical composition that I'm hearing. Generally, this is the case, not always the case, especially in very complicated fugues. So if there is no single real definition or defining fugue type that we can look at, what do we get when we have, what can we do about these smaller versions of fugues that tend to come up, such as the fugato and the fugetta? There's not much that we can do except to say, sorry, that they're attempts to describe the process of the types of imitation and things that composers employ at specific moments to emulate a strict contrapuntal style, or maybe not so strict, just depending on it. These types of ingredients that they might use that we might recognize in a fugato passage might be inversion, stretching the themes out a bit through what's called augmentation, contracting them a bit through diminution, all these different types of things that we can still somehow identify it either as motivically significant or having the similar sort of overarching form to it, shape to the phrase, shape to the motive, still seeming like it's very much a part of it. But specifically looking at tonight's, and we won't, don't worry, we won't be spending a ton of time with keys and stuff like that, but there is, the way that the program is constructed is really nice, I think. And augmentatious, as I put it. We have what is essentially a kind of one way of putting these different preludes and fugues in order that is not the way that you see it in the Well-Tempered Clavier. So when Bach first was putting this together and did the fair copy in 1722, the way that it was ordered in terms of keys is progressive. That is, it just starts at C, and then we move up chromatically until we get to B. It's not maybe the way that you would encounter it in performance, and in fact, you probably would not have encountered it as an entire block in performance. So oftentimes, pianists have the opportunity, or keyboardists, I should say, have the opportunity to put them in particular orders that make sense, and this one does to me. And we'll listen a little bit to hear why it might make sense as well. So in this case, we start with A flat major, and then if we go down a fifth, I'm calling it a fifth, that would give us D flat major, but then we'll give that the minor, we'll say D flat minor, and then we'll enharmonically change that to C sharp minor. So it kind of works out as a fifth. And then if we go down, if you give me that, we go down a fifth from there to F sharp major. And then if we take the relative minor of that as D sharp minor, which is the key of the fugue, we have the same key signature for that. When that ends, it's spelled as D sharp major, but it sounds, we'll hear it as E flat major, which then leads directly to A flat major, which is the key of the Beethoven. That sounds complicated, but it sounds very easy when you actually just hear it to the ear. So I'm wondering, so we'll get a sense of what this sounds like without listening to very much of them. Can we start with disc 1 play the opening of disc 2, and I'll just signal when to change, and it will be skipping by 1. So I'll 2, not disc 1, track 2. Yeah. Okay, well, the point is made. E flat going to A flat. And a brilliant point it was, I'm sure. So we'll just move right on to the second half, which is a slightly different way of looking at it. We have E flat going to G minor, to A minor, to B flat, to B flat. What's happening here is that we have another leap of a fifth, E flat to B flat. Relative minor has the same key signature, G minor, and then we're just oscillating about that kind of B flat axis and then ending on B flat because we want to affirm B flat as the key of the evening. That was a joke there, but I think we'll forego playing those, but when you're listening, just you'll get it. I believe he's going to be playing them straight through, so that you'll start to hear some of these relationships that might be of interest to you. At the time when Bach was writing it, it was, we call this the well-tempered clavier. The tuning is not the same as it is today and is continuing to change today. Lots of people have a lot more to say about this in greater detail than I can, except to say that back in the day, keys had a lot more distinctive character than they do in the cases of equal temperament. And so this was one of the things that was being explored with all these new keys, especially the ones that had some strange key signatures that were not typically seen before Bach wrote the well-tempered clavier. So going back to the A-flat major prelude, we'll just take a look at a couple of things from the Bach that will kind of stand for everything, because there's not enough time to really go into detail on all these pieces. So we're not looking at a fugue in this case, we're looking at a prelude. And this one I think is a great opener because it gives us a very clear sense of relationships that we can hear right away. So in this case, I've labeled X and Y, two ideas that are very much similar. They're just transpositions, a little bit altered, but you can follow the rhythms as being pretty much the same. And then you can see that the same basic thing happens with X and Y. In fact, the exact same thing happens in the left hand, an octave below, as what we heard in the first. So maybe we can hear this is track 1 of that, just the opening. So you can hear quite clearly that these are kind of imitative things, and it's a way to build larger phrases with these smaller ideas. This continues in many, Bach continues this process with great economy. And we find that I just picked out one instance among many just to demonstrate the point. And these are two spots that are distant from each other by about 15 or 16 measures. But what you'll notice is that I've labeled X and Y is that same basic idea that we just listened to. We hear it in the bass, on the one that's on the left, and then we hear it in the treble on the right. There's also certain consistencies that you'll find between little kind of mini imitations. Those are the dashed brackets that show F to A flat to F and G, B flat, G. You can see that on each, the upper and the lower stave. And then, and the same on the other one, you can see that it's B flat to D flat to B flat and C to E flat to C. So these are things that you hear them at slightly different times, but they're kind of little mini imitative ideas. Then we have what I'm calling Z, which here represents just a little figure that has a neighbor note. In this case, the first one is E flat to D to E flat. That happens to be a smaller second than the one that's F to E flat to F, but it's still just a it's rhythmically recognizable, and the direction and contour are recognizable to the ear without having to label it Z, that's the Z idea. That's not the point of this kind of analysis, but it's just a way of saying that is something that gives the piece consistency, or makes references that we can easily understand. Time flies, though, so we've got to look at the next piece, which is the Beethoven Opus 110. I'm sorry, we're skipping the rest of the Bach for now, just because, but there will be the total of 8 pieces in the Preludes and Fugues, the 4 that are selected. Beethoven's Opus 110 A-flat major sonata was written about the time, a little bit concurrently with his last piano sonata. This is his penultimate sonata. It's a step back from, in terms of, it has an air of simplicity without being simple. From what he had done before, if you look at, say, like the Hammerklavier Sonata, Opus 106, which was just, I think, a year and a half previously to the A-flat major composed. Before we look at briefly at how he deals with the fugue, I just want to point out that at this point in Beethoven's life, regardless of the state of his hearing, he still has this exceptional ability to orchestrate at the keyboard. And I make this statement about Beethoven, but I may as well be saying it about every other composer on this program. It doesn't matter, when I say orchestrating at the keyboard, I don't mean saying like, these are the trumpets, these could be the strings, or one could do that and that's fine, but I mean that they treat the different registers and the different types of sound that one can achieve at a given keyboard instrument in ways that are tonally significant and dramatically significant. So I just picked one example among many where Beethoven does this. You can see those little pickup chords, the little grace notes that precede beat 2 of the first measure there. And then they can kind of continue through that second measure that you see. Those help to kind of fill out the sound in those spots. But then he abandons them and continues up to that top note without any support. Now, he might have chosen to do octaves or something like that, but it's not, for him, it wasn't just a question of building sound, it was building a particular type of sound. And what we end up hearing when you have just a single pitch at that greater remove from the bass is a very unique sort of sound. So that's just something to listen for in these pieces. It's just the way that these composers treat sound is a very thoughtful one. Of course, we know that with Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, but at the same time, it's worth pointing out because those are the kinds of details that really give life to the music, I think. When we look at the fugue, it comes into play in an interesting way in the sonata. Ostensibly, the work is in 3 movements in terms of what you see on the page, but really it's divided into many further. Well, maybe not many further, but it depends on how you parse it. So you have the first movement, and then you have a scherzo second movement, and then you have this like adagio and recitative kind of vocal quality type of improvisatory passage that leads to this very beautiful arioso theme, kind of a lugubrious kind of passage, a whole section. And this section leads directly to the first presentation of the fugue. And he marks it fuga. Maybe we can play, this is track 11. So I wanted you to hear that transition that leads into it first. That's the end of the ario, so we didn't have time to hear the full thing, but we will in a little bit. And now compare that with this really, I think, just a kind of a magical but simple moment that leads to the return of the fugue, but this time in its inversion. He even labels it as such so that we don't miss it. I wanted to let that play on just a little bit so that you could hear how little tiny ideas start to get parsed and then get reinvented and turned into something else, which is a very Beethovenian thing to do, but it's also a very fugal thing to do. It's part of what this is about. Building something out of something that's recognizable but can have many different types of utility. What's, of course, the most obvious difference about this versus, say, the Bach fugues that you'll hear preceding the Beethoven is the way that it's split now into, at the easiest way of looking at it, 4 different sections. So we have the arioso, then we have initial presentation of the fugue. Then we have a return to the arioso in a much more impassioned form, and then a return to the fugue with the, in this case, inverted. And then some people think that it's, you might call the very end a different thing because it moves out of fugal textures, but it's still basically the summation, and there's an arc to it. And that's going to be important with Brahms, too, is understanding this arc that people are going for. So it becomes less about just making some sort of academic statement as it is about making some sort of a musical journey and helping the listener to appreciate it. So moving ahead 40 or so years, we get to the opening of the Brahms Handel Variations. This manuscript dates from 1861. And at this point, it's not exactly named in the way that we know, which is the Variations and Fugue on a theme by Handel. Instead, it says Variationen für ein lieblich Fräulein. So this is for Clara Schumann. So the who performed it, and but not exactly up to Brahms' level of expectations. Brahms also played this for her, but Clara had to do it in difficult circumstances where she had a limited amount of time to actually perform. I think she did both of the piano quartets as well, but definitely Opus 25, which comes right after this set of Opus 24, and she learned these pieces very quickly, and of course, eventually did a very good job with them, but it caused a small falling out for a brief period of time. Brahms at this point is 28, so he's already accomplished a lot, but he's not quite at the level where he's got the great kind of recognition that he wants for himself. I don't mean in terms of public recognition, but I mean in terms of feeling that he has complete command of what he's doing. And this is getting back to that idea of mastering one's art. So one way to do that is to kind of deal with the past by encountering the forms. And Brahms does this repeatedly throughout his career. One of the most famous examples being the finale movement of the Fourth Symphony, where he takes on a Passacaglia and kind of creates this great movement out of it, which is, it's interesting because it is an achievement, but it's also in some ways it's an easy way to have some sort of basic structure that you can work with. And something similar is happening with the Handel Variations. And what I mean by that is that the theme itself, which is an aria from a suite that Handel composed, and he actually wrote in the same key, B flat, and he composed, I think, 5 variations on this aria in that original suite. It has the same basic periodic structure, and Brahms maintains that almost without exception for the entire duration of the work. So when we look at it here, we'll just, the setting that Brahms has here, just that you see the theme at the beginning, it's basically 4 measures repeated, and then a second group of 4 measures repeated. And it's quite ornamented, but we see right away that, that Brahms embraces this ornamentation in a way that's very different from the way that Handel did. So if we just look at the particulars of towards the end of Variation 1 in the Handel versus the end of Variation 1 in the Brahms, I'm not meaning to say one is better than the other or anything like that. First of all, they're quite distinct in so many different ways, but rather that they treat the material, you can still see that they're kind of engaging in the same argument, but already Brahms is moving quite a bit away and emphasizing those details like the ornamentation and whatnot. So one of the great pleasures of being able to look at holograph manuscripts by composers who we can't speak to now is we get a window into their process. And this particular piece offered us a few options. I was able to meet with Pierre-Laurent Aimard yesterday to talk over a number of these different changes that were made to the score, and it was just a great pleasure to be able to look at this in detail. Because it's not always just, once you have a fair copy, which is what this basically is, it's pretty much a done piece. And so composers will sometimes put in different dynamic markings, maybe change a tempo here or there. I think actually in the previous, this first page, you can see that he's put in a second ending in pencil at the very end on the bottom right side of the screen. You can kind of see that pencil. He would do this throughout this, and it was just a way of saying, I need to do something differently to transition between movements or between variations. But sometimes they become a bit more significant. I'm just going to point out a couple of these, just because I think it's an interesting thing. And I think it's important to see these as living documents and not just these notes on a page that have come down from ages past, that these are things that were workable and that Brahms might have changed his mind later. In fact, he did in certain cases. So at the end of Variation 8, at the very top right, I don't know if you can see it too well, but what you should see is some penciled in notes underneath on the top right. Basically, those are, he originally had just same repeated notes in the left hand that keep going on and on. But instead, he decides to have them go up an octave and up another octave. This is the kind of orchestrational decision where it doesn't change the harmony, it just doesn't change that sort of a thing, but it does change the affect and the motion of the piece. So that's one example of a type of change. Another major example is changing the order entirely of the variations. It's been said of this piece and other variation sets that sometimes you could just arbitrarily take them out and put them into a different order and no one would be the wiser. And maybe that's true. In certain cases, each variation is sort of a clear set idea unto itself that's absolutely true. But there's also this very clear directionality that is dealt with in particular ways that are more or less effective. And Brahms sensed this when he was looking at this particular sequence of variations. So coming out of Variation 14, you have this very strong movement and use of sixths in the right hand, especially you'll kind of see at the top of the page, you see those sixths going back and forth. What happens when, I'm not sure how practical this will be on disc 2, by the way. What happens is that you start to get a sort of back and forth thing if you're not careful about how you handle the order of the variations. So the way that Brahms had it originally, we'll just hear a little bit of that. I'm not sure if this will work, but starting in track 15, this will be Variation 14. We'll come back to that shortly. So that was just a snippet from each of these 4 variations in their original order. Now, one of the things that we see, and that's going on to the 17th variation. In the new ordering, Brahms takes advantage of what he had actually originally written. So we have those sixths that I pointed out just a moment ago. This is at the end of Variation 14. Then we have this, what I'm referring to in the title there in terms of the hunting, which is basically interval contraction and expansion. You'll often hear this because of the way that horns are tuned, where you have, as you go higher, you get closer together, and so you might start with an octave, then fifths, and getting smaller, to where you have a third at the top and then coming back down. In this case, you have the reverse at the end of variation 14, and that's the part I've labeled in the second measure, interval contraction and expansion. Then if you go directly into the new variation 15, you see that you get the tonal inversion of that material, and that's also labeled now interval expansion and then contraction. So you start to have this actual, it was already there, he'd already written the variations in that particular order, but this brings out a particular relationship, especially the thirds and sixths, which are also inversions of each other. If you have a sixth and you put the sixth underneath, it turns into a third. He takes advantage of that in a way that makes the variations move together a bit more smoothly. Additionally, it has the advantage now of ending perfectly into variation 17. I'm trying not to get these confused. To where with the new end of variation 16, it leads very smoothly into variation 17. So instead of talking about that ad nauseum here, why don't we just listen to that? So this will be starting from 15, and we'll just listen through to the beginning of 18. I apologize. So when you hear it without that delay, it does move in smoothly into that new variation. So those types of decisions are made at various stages in the compositional process. In this case, a fairly late stage. It's just important to note and interesting to consider what it would have been like if he hadn't done that. I don't think that people would have thought less of the piece, to be honest. But at the same time, one has this sense that, yeah, that seemed like the right move. Sometimes you find an earlier version of that composers do, and you think, wow, I wish that he or she had just kept it the way it was, because that was kind of maybe a bit more effective. But this is kind of one of the fun things about being able to look at these older manuscripts. Some of these changes that composers make don't make it into the final versions. So it's not always, when you talk about urtext and like these final word kind of volumes that people put together these days, which are important in their own way for sure, they don't always embody some very interesting ideas that the composer might have put down at the beginning. And this is one that was just pointed out to me yesterday in that talk, which is that at the top here in variation 21, he wrote in pizzicato, and he's pointing to the grace notes. And why is this important? Because it's an orchestrational detail. He doesn't mean that you're going to reach in and pluck the string, although that would be impressive. I would have to say, I'm going to dare any pianist to take that on. But what's important about that word with respect to the grace notes is that's where you get the thematic reference. The theme is in the grace notes. So he's saying there's a color choice that you can make in the way that you articulate those grace notes that would allow it to sing in a particular way that makes it the theme more clear. So those types of things are very interesting, I think, to be able to see, and that's what we can learn from this that you won't find in a modern edition. Sometimes you do as footnotes, but not all the time. Another case that I think is worth taking note of is that the way that a composer writes, especially if it's handwritten, is very evocative of what they might be asking for in the music itself. That's not always true. There's plenty of passionate music that looks about as staid as one can have it. But there's this passage work that is leading to the final fugue in the Brahms, where he clearly, it starts to have this sweep to the way that he's writing. And you can see this especially in the variation 24 at the bottom of this page, but also leading into it from the variation 23, which is very much the same type of material, just slightly different. And all I'm referring to really are just the way that it looks. It matches the way that it sounds. Let me think, what is that? It's gonna be, could you play just the beginning of track 25? So you get this sense of sweep, this sense of motion, and you see this, and there's other material that has a certain similarity to this earlier in the variation set, but doesn't have the same sort of handwriting signature that this does. One can read too much into that, of course. It might have been just getting tired and just ready to be done with it, because at this point he was just copying it out too. So it wasn't like in the midst of the compositional process, probably. But it is something that you tend to see, and it's another interesting component. When we get to the fugue, there's an interesting kind of moment that's reminiscent to me of Schumann, especially Schumann of the symphonic etudes, the 25th variation here. And all I want to point out about the fugue here, because it's a big fugue, it's a good 5 minutes or so, and it's a great closer, is that you start to see, again, the same types of techniques that are being used by both Bach and Beethoven before, namely taking a small cellular idea and then expanding it to produce a larger phrase, and then using those cellular ideas as accompanimental figuration. Just like in the Bach, in the A-flat prelude, it wasn't a fugue, but there's that little turn idea, that neighbor note idea that went back and forth. That was a little snippet that was aurally recognizable, and you'd hear. You have the same exact thing here, almost verbatim, just inverted in the Brahms, and so that starts to be used. You can see, well, it'll be better just to hear it when we get to it, and just hear how they're put together. The other point I'd like to make about the Brahms fugue in particular, and it also applies to the Beethoven and to some of the Bach fugues as well, is that the issues, it starts to become a case of what is important dramatically to the music, to push things forward. And Brahms at this point, I feel that there's a great sense of ease with which he writes this fugue, that it feels like this is exactly what it needs to be for him, and it encompasses him as a pianist as well as a composer. And this was, I think, one of the most important moves for Brahms, because as a pianist, he was able to kind of make the fugue his own in this way. So what you'll hear are figurations and different types of sonorities put together with the recognizable fugal elements that start to take on a life of their own, as almost like their own little cellular motivic ideas that could even be sort of like a textural subject or something like that. I'm not saying that he treats it exactly in a sort of academic way that way, but you do start to get that feeling, and eventually you start to forget about the fact that you're in the midst of this kind of learned composition and just hear it as music. And I think that that's also something that I suspect happens to a lot of us when we listen to a fugue, is that we kind of think at the beginning, okay, there's a voice, and there's an answer, and then it comes back maybe at the same pitch or something like that, and we follow it through this exposition, but at some point, we start to just appreciate the way that these voices are interacting in a way that, that just makes for great music. So with that, I'd like to just go ahead and close and be happy to take any questions you might have. And if you could just wait for...
Do any musicians you know go through these pieces the way you did, the different versions of the same piece by the composer?
Was the question, do musicians go through them?
Yes.
Yeah.
The way you did.
Yes. It just depends on the person and the access that they have. So one of the issues is that often we might have a version of the piece that we have back home that we used, when we were kids maybe, or something like that. And eventually you start to look for other editions, maybe edited by different people who you admire. But if you're at a professional level and you're performing, you tend to want to make your own decisions as much as you can, especially when dealing with these particular types of pieces. And so oftentimes performers are performer scholars. They'll go through and do their own research, and I think that what they and of course I can't speak for anybody, but I do think that there is a sense in which they arrive at the conclusion that here's a way that I want to present this music that I believe is faithful to an idea that was perhaps held by the composer, but not necessarily fidelity to a particular text. And just like I was saying with the Brahms, you have all these notes here that are in Brahms' handwriting that did not make it into a final edition. So, okay, maybe he thought better of it and took it out later. But there's something about maybe an idea, that a kernel of something that is worth keeping. And so I think it's up to each musician to make a decision about what they'd like to do. And the last thing I'd say about that is that one of the goals of libraries and other institutions is to try to make the people who, or the institutions that hold these manuscripts, is to try to make them as available to those people as possible. And so, for instance, this particular manuscript, anybody here can go online to our Performing Arts Encyclopedia and take a look at it yourself, and you can download images. We don't have all of our manuscripts up that way, but that's a way to make them accessible to others.
All right.
I think we have another question.
Is there any Handel left in the Fugue?
It's too hot to handle, so I couldn't put it in. Sorry about that. No. Oh, go ahead.
How long did Brahms work on the manuscript for this, and over what time frame?
You know what? I don't know exactly the answer to that, but I know that he was. It was finished in 1861. I think it was relatively quick, but I don't want to say incorrectly because it's dated September 1861, which was the birthday of Clara Schumann was in that month. So I have a feeling it was in the months just preceding that, but not sure. Is there another question? Got another one. Just one moment.
Thank you. I have a question out of complete ignorance.
Oh.
Is the fugue the only structure in which a single theme is taken and repeated and kind of varied on, as opposed to beginning at some point and ending at another? Is that true of the fugue?
No, well, that's actually a great and something that I could have been much clearer about. That's a very good question. To answer it quickly, I would say that if you take an idea, a musical idea, you can do lots of things to that musical idea, especially in a tonal context. So you can turn it upside down, you can lengthen it, you can shorten it. To do that, you can do that with any piece of music. So sonatas, that's what a lot of composers do. They'll present material, and they'll present contrasting material with it perhaps. They might have it be accompanied or not, and then they'll tend to develop it in some way. And that idea of development is where a lot of these different components come into play, like imitation. So it's not just the purview of kind of fugal academic writing. It's just that in a fugue, there tends to be a particular sequence of things that one expects to find in that expository section. So you'd have a subject that's presented, it often is pretty short, and then you'll have kind of an answer to that subject, which is basically a transposition of that same material at a different level, usually a fifth above, or depending on the situation. And then, so but like I said, there's no single way that a fugue is constructed. There's also no single way that a sonata is constructed. And you still have people writing sonatas in very different ways. In some ways, it's almost a sonata by fiat. They say it's a sonata, so it's a sonata. With the fugue, it's a little harder to do that because at some point you say, well, I don't hear any imitation or something like that. But, so I hope that kind of answers a little bit, but it applies to lots of different things. Is there another question?
This may be too hot to handle too, but I was wondering about the performers on the recordings that we heard and in the examples, and ones that you maybe new people that you think are good at interpretation.
I will tell you who you heard. I think I'll stay away from the other. The Bach that you heard is from Pierre-Laurent Aimard's new CD that was just released in August. And he has the entirety of Book 1 on it. Again, there's another discussion that's worth having and interesting to have about choosing to play it on a piano versus another type of instrument and those types of things. But pianists tend to play on piano, so that's why I chose that. The Beethoven is Paul Lewis, who was here a couple of years ago, and the Handel, the Brahms, I'm actually just blanking on, but it's a different pianist, so I apologize for that. But, so sorry, yeah, but yeah. So I think we have time for one more question, if there's anybody. This one up here.
It seems to me a few years ago at the Freer Gallery, I remember hearing the Brahms, but it was two pianists. It was Emanuel Ax and a woman.
Maybe
I'm wondering, did Brahms recast this several times?
Are you thinking the Haydn Variations?
Oh, okay.
No, because he did a two-piano version of that one. Yeah, which is also a great piece. Yeah. We can take one more if there's one more. But there doesn't have to be one more. Well, thank you. Oh, well, one more. Okay, one more.
You didn't go into the origins of the fugue, and most people, I think, in the most elementary way, think of it as developing out of the round. And here, I know I do. I hear the round in almost every fugue, and that's the way I approach it. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's a very complicated issue, and there's history going way before Bach's time in terms of where a fugue comes from, things like the Reisercar, all these other types of predecessors. But ultimately, what they're founded on, and I think it would be better to look to somebody who's more of a scholar in that area than I am. But ultimately, what they're founded on are relationships between ideas of counterpoint and imitation and those types of things, and imitative behaviors. So certain types of rules start to develop over time. When I say rules, I'm not saying necessarily written down rules, but just rules that tend to work in practice. Over time, those develop and eventually become codified by different theorists at different points. I'm thinking of the gradus ad parnassum or things like that, where people are trying to come to grips with what's happening, not necessarily providing a groundwork for how people should produce. But eventually you do get that as well. And so there's this lengthy process development that is not a singular branch on a tree, I think. I think that there are lots of different approaches that, and even today, people still write fugues, but it's, maybe most of them tend to be traceable to the 18th century in terms of where they're coming from, in terms of what they identify as a fugue proper. But I think that other traditions are also represented. So sorry, I'm not able to succinctly address that. But well, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's concert. I'm sure you will.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.